The worst part wasn't being insulted. It was watching people pretend the insult was true. At a community foundation I had helped build for 11 years, our new board chair stood in front of 30 donors and said, "Let's remember she's just a volunteer." People laughed politely. Others looked away. Nobody corrected him. Nobody mentioned that I had recruited half the foundation's mentors. Nobody mentioned I'd built the scholarship program from scratch. Nobody mentioned I'd spent more than a decade helping keep the organization alive. I said nothing. I just sat there and waited. Because 10 minutes earlier I'd received a text message. A foundation attorney was on his way, and he was carrying a sealed folder. The board chair thought he was about to celebrate his first major victory. Instead, he was about to learn why the foundation's oldest members looked nervous every time he used the phrase, "my foundation." My name is Elena Whitaker, and this is what happened. I joined the Harbor Bridge Foundation when I was 26. Back then, we operated from 2 borrowed rooms above a bookstore. No salaries, no fancy offices, no corporate sponsors, just people trying to help students afford college. Interesting, because nobody involved expected it to become important. The foundation's founder was Margaret Ellis. Everyone called her Maggie. She hated titles, loved spreadsheets, and believed communities were stronger when ordinary people showed up consistently. I learned more from her than anyone else. I didn't know it yet. That mattered. 3 months after Maggie retired, everything changed. The board elected a new chair. His name was Victor Lang. Confident, polished, charismatic. The kind of man who entered rooms as if applause should already be happening. That was my first warning. At first, Victor's changes seemed harmless. New logo, new branding, new slogans. Because people rarely resist cosmetic changes. That's how bigger changes slip through unnoticed. And Victor understood that perfectly. Then I noticed something strange. The foundation newsletter highlighted recent achievements, scholarship growth, mentorship expansion, volunteer recruitment, everything I'd spent years building. Because my name wasn't mentioned once. Not once. I told myself it didn't matter. I was wrong. At a donor breakfast, Victor introduced key leaders, board members, sponsors, corporate partners. Then he introduced me, and smiled. "This is Elena, one of our volunteers." Just a volunteer. Nothing technically false, but not exactly true either, because manipulation often hides inside accurate words. Over the next month, Victor started telling the foundation's history differently, subtly, carefully. According to him, the organization transformed only after modern leadership arrived, because modern leadership always seemed to mean him. The people who built everything before him kept disappearing from the story. Then came the donor dinner, the event that changed everything. 30 major supporters, press coverage, community leaders. Victor loved the attention. Then during his speech, he pointed toward me and smiled. That smile worried me immediately. Victor raised his glass, then said, "People get emotionally attached to organizations." Polite laughter. Then he looked directly at me. "But we have to remember some people are just volunteers." The room went silent. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't. Everyone understood who he meant, and nobody stopped him. I didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't defend myself. Because some battles are won by timing, not volume. Then the conference room door opened. A man in a dark suit walked inside, carrying a sealed folder, the foundation's attorney, and the moment Victor saw him, his smile disappeared. That changed everything. The attorney's name was Calvin Brooks. He had worked with the foundation since the bookstore days. Quiet man, sharp eyes, never dramatic. Which made his arrival even more unsettling. Victor forced a smile. "Calvin." Unexpected. Calvin looked at him, then at me, then said, "That was the point." The sealed folder was thick, cream-colored, official. Victor stared at it like it might bite him. Because confident people do not fear folders, unless they know paperwork can contradict them. Calvin placed it on the table, then said, "We need to pause the vote." The room changed instantly. Nobody had mentioned a vote to me. That was strange. Very strange. Board member Lydia Chen looked down. So did two others, because embarrassment spreads fast when secrets become visible. I asked quietly, "What vote?" Victor's jaw tightened. That told me plenty. Victor cleared his throat. "Minor governance update." Calvin didn't blink. "It removes founding advisor review." Silence. Founding advisor review. That was Maggie's safeguard, the clause protecting community programs from political donors. Victor wanted it gone. Then Calvin opened the folder. First page. Highlighted section. My name. Elena Whitaker. Founding Program Steward. Victor's face changed, because he had called me just a volunteer. But the Foundation's own records said something very different, and everyone saw it. Calvin slid copies across the table. Meeting minutes. 9 years old, 7 years old, 5 years old. My reports, my program designs, my signatures. Not legal ownership, not money power. Operational authority. Documented. Repeated. Ignored. Victor looked sick. Then Calvin said, "This review began after donor complaints." Victor stiffened. "What complaints?" Calvin calmly replied, "Concerns that program history was being misrepresented." Because donors noticed. The same donors Victor tried to impress. The humiliation shifted direction. Lydia finally looked up. I raised one concern. Victor turned on her. "You did what?" "Bad move. Very bad move." She straightened. "Victor, you removed Elena from the scholarship archive." Silence. There it was. Not accident. Removal. And now the room knew. That archive mattered. It tracked every scholarship recipient, every mentor, every program founder. Victor had called it outdated clutter, because erasing archives is easier than earning legacy. I looked at him. He looked away. That was the first time he did. Calvin pulled one more document. Also, page 4 of the amended bylaws is missing. Victor froze. Actually froze. Calvin continued. Conveniently, that page contains Elena's advisory trigger. This was no longer disrespect. It was concealment. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. Because everyone was trying to understand what Calvin had just said. My advisory trigger? Because I had never heard that phrase before. Then Calvin looked at me and asked, "Margaret never told you?" My stomach dropped. Calvin opened another file. Older. Much older. Signed by Maggie herself. Then he explained. Years ago, after a donor tried to pressure the foundation into changing scholarship criteria, Maggie created a safeguard. One person. One independent reviewer. One final checkpoint. Because that reviewer wasn't a board member. It was me. Victor laughed. Nervously. That's ridiculous. Calvin ignored him. Then looked at me. Maggie trusted consistency more than titles. The room went silent. Everyone understood something. I wasn't important because of authority. I was important because I had stayed. 11 years. Every scholarship cycle. Every mentorship launch. Every fundraising drive. Because while board members rotated in and out, I remained. Maggie had noticed. Apparently, more than I realized. Then Calvin revealed the next problem. The bylaw amendment Victor wanted approved. Because it wasn't just administrative, it wasn't harmless, it would remove community oversight, reduce transparency, and transfer major decisions to a small executive group. Now donors looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Victor finally snapped, "This organization needs professional leadership." Silence. Because whenever people start losing control, they often attack credibility. Then he looked directly at me. She has no formal authority. Wrong move. Very wrong move. A donor named Ruth Ellison slowly stood. 80 years old. Sharp as a knife. Then she said, "Actually, Victor, I funded Elena's first mentorship initiative." Victor froze. Ruth continued. "I remember who built this foundation." He wasn't controlling the room anymore. Then Lydia dropped another surprise, because apparently she had been collecting information for months. Then she opened her laptop and displayed archived correspondence, emails, messages, internal notes, Victor's requests, specific requests, dangerous requests. One email read, Reduce references to early volunteers in public materials. Another. Focus communications on current leadership achievements. Because this wasn't modernization, it was rebranding history, and now everyone could see it. Then Calvin revealed the final reason he came, the reason for the sealed folder, the reason donors requested review, the reason Victor suddenly looked terrified. A financial partner had paused a 6-figure grant. Not because of money, not because of performance, because of governance concerns. And the grant committee specifically requested one thing: an independent review from the person named in Maggie's safeguard clause. Me. That was the moment Victor realized something. The woman he publicly called just a volunteer was now standing between him and the biggest funding decision of his career. And he had created that problem himself. Nobody cared about Victor's speech anymore. Nobody cared about branding, or titles, or presentations, because 6-figure grants get people's attention very quickly. Then donor Ruth asked, "How much is frozen?" Victor immediately looked away. "Bad sign. Very bad sign," Calvin answered. $750,000. Silence. Absolute silence, because Harbor Bridge had never received a grant that large before. Not once. That money could fund hundreds of students. Victor's little governance changes looked much bigger. Then Calvin explained the condition. The funding committee wanted proof. Proof the foundation still followed its original mission. Proof it hadn't become concentrated under one person. Proof community oversight still existed. Because the review wasn't about finances. It was about trust. And trust was exactly what Victor had damaged. Victor forced a smile, then said, "Well, Elena can approve everything today." Because now he needed me. 3 months earlier I was just a volunteer. Now I was suddenly important. Funny how that works. I looked directly at him, then calmly replied, "I haven't reviewed anything." Silence. His smile vanished. Because approval wasn't automatic. Approval required investigation, and investigation creates risk. That changed everything. Then another surprise arrived. Lydia had invited several former volunteers to attend virtually. Because Victor didn't know. One by one they appeared on screen. People who helped build programs years earlier. People erased from newsletters. People removed from recognition materials. Victor's version of history started collapsing. Then Calvin revealed something nobody expected. A video file, recorded shortly before Maggie retired. The room froze. Interesting. Because Maggie had been gone nearly 2 years, she was back. The screen flickered on. Maggie appeared, smiling. Older, tired, but unmistakably Maggie. Then she said, "Organizations fail when leaders start believing they own what they only temporarily manage." Silence. Deep silence. And everyone knew exactly who needed to hear that. Then Maggie continued, because apparently she'd anticipated future problems. Then she said, "If someone begins erasing contributors, they're not protecting the mission, they're protecting their ego." Victor looked physically uncomfortable, because now the criticism wasn't coming from me, it was coming from the founder herself. The video ended. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then board member Thomas Reed stood up, then another, then another. Because power shifts slowly, until suddenly it doesn't. Then Thomas said, "I move that all governance changes be suspended immediately." Second board member, "I second it." Victor lost control of the room, for the first time since becoming chair. The panic in his eyes told me he knew it too. Victor tried one last time, because people rarely surrender power willingly. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "This is becoming personal." Wrong answer. Very wrong answer. Because nobody was talking about feelings anymore. They were talking about evidence. And evidence doesn't care about personalities. Board member Thomas Reed stood again, then calmly said, "I move for a vote of no confidence." Silence. Absolute silence. Because everyone knew what that meant. Not a warning. Not a reprimand. An ending. Victor understood exactly how serious this had become. The vote took less than 5 minutes. Because people usually know how they'll vote long before ballots are cast. Then the results were announced. Unanimous. Every single board member. Victor sat motionless. Because the room he'd controlled for months had just rejected him completely. When the meeting resumed, the chair at the front of the room sat empty. Because titles disappear faster than people expect. One moment you're leading, the next you're watching. Victor had no authority at all. That changed everything. 2 weeks later, I joined a call with the grant committee. Nervous, exhausted, still processing everything. Then the committee chair smiled and said, "We've completed our review." My stomach dropped. Because $750,000 wasn't just funding, it was opportunity for hundreds of students. The committee didn't ask about Victor because they weren't interested in one person. They were interested in culture, integrity, mission. Then they said, "We believe Harbor Bridge still remembers why it exists." Silence. Good silence. Then came the next sentence. The grant was approved. A month later, the foundation hosted its annual scholarship banquet. Interesting, because for years I preferred staying behind the scenes, building things quietly, letting students shine. But this year was different. Then board member Lydia walked onto the stage and said my name. The audience applauded. Longer than I expected. Longer than I was comfortable with. Then Lydia handed me something. Not an award. Not a plaque. A framed photograph. Boom. It showed Maggie, me, and 6 students from our very first scholarship class. On the back she'd written, "The people who stay are the people who matter." I cried. Not because of recognition. Because I missed her. 3 days later, Victor called. Because fallen leaders always want one final conversation. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Silence. Then he said, "I thought I was helping?" Maybe he believed that, maybe not. Then I replied, "You stopped serving the mission and started serving yourself." Silence. Long silence. Then he hung up. And that was the last time we spoke. 6 months later, Harbor Bridge funded more students than any year in its history. Former volunteers returned. Donor confidence grew, programs expanded, and Maggie's values stayed exactly where they belonged, at the center. Sometimes people still tell me Victor's biggest mistake was underestimating me. They're wrong. That wasn't his biggest mistake. His biggest mistake was believing the foundation belonged to the people sitting at the head table. It didn't. It belonged to every student helped, every volunteer who stayed late, every mentor who showed up, every person who quietly carried the mission forward, including me. The day Victor called me just a volunteer, he thought he was reducing my importance. Instead, he reminded everyone exactly who built the foundation. And when the attorney walked through that door carrying a sealed folder, the room finally remembered too.